Now I've had some inquiries on how I route a binding channel on a curved surface like an arm contour, and it's pretty simple, so I'll put together a quick video so you can see how I do it. Firstly, you've got your binding bit, which looks like this, and you've got a bearing that is screwed onto the top there, and you can change that bearing out for different sizes. The reason you would do that is because you've got the blade is offset to the side there, so the smaller you go with the binding, with the bearing, the wider channel you're going to cut. So I've got a bearing on there that's sized perfectly for this binding. So if I put the binding alongside the bearing and I run my finger over there, it's virtually flush with that blade. So I know that the channel that it cuts is going to be the correct thickness for this binding. So if I was using thinner binding, I would change the bearing out for a slightly larger one, and if I was going for a deeper channel, well, of course we'd change the bearing over for a smaller one. So the next part of the equation is just this little jig here, and that's attached to my small handheld router, and it's just screwed into the base there, and I've now put the binding bit is now installed in there. We've got some wheels on the back here, and they slot into this thing here, and they ride up and down on here, so that can freely move up and down. So what's going to happen is the guitar is going to be just passed through under there, and this donut here is going to ride along the top of the guitar like so, and that will cut the channel. And you can see that even on an arm contour like this, that will ride down and it will just follow the depth of the contour. Now there is a limit to the clearance under here. You have to be very careful, because there comes a point where you can't do too much of a arm contour, because this will bottom out on the top of the guitar. So I can only go about 12 mil. So whenever I do a guitar with binding on an arm contour, this is never going to be a very deep arm contour. And at its bottom amount of travel, it's still too high to actually reach the guitar. So I need to prop this guitar up. I usually use a couple of old templates that are the same shape, just to elevate it enough that it actually pushes this up and we can ride the bearing. So those two templates just underneath this guitar are enough that it will actually allow the jig to sit on the guitar. Now obviously I've got binding on this guitar, so we're not binding it again, but if I push this around here, you can see the jig is moving up and down. And that's how the whole process works. This will just rise up and down and follow the contours. And the next thing we need to do is to adjust the cutting depth. So we just wind this down a little bit. We're going to see how much we're going to cut into the guitar body, and I like to just cut it a little bit shallower than the binding is. 3/4 of a mil, 1/2 mil shorter. So about there is perfect. So I've altered the method that I use for putting binding on as well, so I'll quickly show you that. I've got a little bottle and I've got it filled with acetone, and then I've got one of those little StewMac little tips, and it just gives you a very fine tip for applying the acetone. So what I've done is I've used the heat gun, and I've got no acetone, no glue or anything is on here. All I've done is just shaped the binding to the body shape and taped it in place using the heat gun. I only used the heat gun around the horns. Pretty much all of this was, obviously there's no big curves here, so it's easy enough just to shape it by hand. Now what I've been doing lately is just removing a piece of tape. You can see there's a gap down there, and then I've just been running a bead of acetone in there and then just pushing it shut. I'll just hold it in place with a couple of fingers, and this will take in about 30 seconds. Okay, that's already glued in place. Let's put a little mark on there so I know where I started, and I'll continue to work around this corner here. So we've glued up to there. I can actually see it. So the beauty of this is the acetone wicks in. You put it on the edge there, and it just gets absorbed. You can see it getting sucked in. Put a liberal amount on. Just a little bit of tape, and you can hold it with your fingers. You get a really good amount of pressure by just holding it. You're not holding it for long. We'll give that another 30 seconds. If you can see any gaps, you can apply a little bit of pressure there and just close that gap up before it sets. Okay, that's set off as well. So that's really quick. We've done from here to here in literally a minute. Okay, so we just loosen those two bits of tape, and you can see there's a gap there. Just close that gap up with my fingers. Okay, that's set. Alright, so we've sealed up until this point here, so we need to, I'm actually going to do this whole section together. Up until this point here, where the tape is, the binding is quite happy just to sit against the edge flush there. So this is the area here we need to concentrate on, and I'll get my fingers in here and we'll really get some decent pressure on there. Get my fingers in there, and that's the section. The difficult section to seal is the section I'll hold with my fingers. I'll just fill this little gap here. You see, sometimes the tape isn't strong enough to just really hold that in properly. If you just rely on the tape, you'll tend to peel the tape back when you've finished, and there'll be little hairline gaps. So I'd rather just hold it in for a minute with my fingers, just enough for the acetone to melt the binding and then evaporate, and it should hold itself in place at that point. Okay, this should be alright now. I'll just keep an eye on that for a moment just to make sure it doesn't open up. It's looking pretty good. You can see a little bit of squeeze out there. That's melted binding, which is a good thing to see. So we're glued up to here now. It's actually just staying in shape by itself. That's because I use the heat gun to actually pre-shape that. Always feel around here to make sure it's all flush. Okay, so these inner curves here, you can see we've got some separation there. I need to remove these bits of tape here so we can get enough slack to pull that in. This section I think I'm just going to hold with my fingers. We'll run some acetone in there, and then I'll just physically push that in there and then pull that down there, and I'll just hold it for a minute. Alright, that's quite a bit of acetone we just pumped in there. Now I'm just going to hold that as hard as I can and just keep the pressure there as long as I can. You could never get this sort of clamping pressure just using the tape. Sometimes you just have to get in there with your hands and hold it in place. I mean, obviously I'm being a little bit pedantic here, just trying to get it absolutely perfect, but if you find you get some gaps, you just have to make some filler up using acetone and binding, melt it down and just rub it into the gaps, and you won't see them. But if we can get it to a point where we don't need any filler, I mean, that's obviously what we want to strive for. Okay, that looks pretty good. I can't see that opening up. I'll just keep this other finger in place just for a moment. In fact, I'll hold that there while I run some acetone in here. Left-handed. There we go. The majority of the binding in this corner is going to be routed out with the neck pocket anyway, but we still need to get it on there nice and tight in this section here. Just this section here is where I've got a little bit of separation. And you can see when I push that in, I get a bit of squeeze out, and that's great because that's binding and acetone mixed together, which is basically it's the glue that's holding this binding onto the body. So not only is that squeeze out going to glue it in place, it's also going to act as a filler to fill any little voids that may be there. And what you're seeing here is all sweat. It's a really hot Sydney summer day today, and it's pretty brutal here in the workshop. Okay, so that's really nice. In fact, the whole lot we've done so far has been very, very good. Alright, so the binding is now on the body, and it's just a little bit proud at the top, and it's got on really well. Really pleased with that. There's no obvious gaps anywhere at all. So the next step would be just to scrape this flush with the body, then hit it with a sander and sand the top clean. Alright, so that's our top done. The body is all scraped, the binding is all flush all the way around. So that's completed.